You have 48 hours to vacate your office, Patrick told me with that smug expression I'd come to recognize over the past 3 months. He slid a termination letter across the mahogany desk. My father's desk, though Patrick seemed to have forgotten that detail. Sign here and we'll process your severance by Friday. I picked up the pen but I didn't sign. Instead, I looked him directly in the eye and said, I'll need to review this with my legal team first. His jaw tightened. Amaya, don't make this difficult. The board has already approved the restructuring. Your role as Chief Operating Officer is redundant under the new management structure. 4 days later, Patrick received notice that I now owned 51% of Nova Dynamics Corporation, the company my father built from nothing, and that his employment was terminated effective immediately. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me explain how a 34-year-old woman who dedicated 12 years of her life to a family business managed to take it back from the man who married into it and then tried to steal it. My name is Amaya Sloan. Well, it was Amaya Chin before I married Patrick 5 years ago, and it'll be Amaya Chin again once the divorce finalizes. I'm the daughter of Raymond Chin, who founded Nova Dynamics in 1988 as a small electronics manufacturing firm in Portland, Oregon. By the time I joined the company in 2013 at age 22, fresh out of Stanford with a degree in electrical engineering and business administration, we'd grown to 340 employees and $78 million in annual revenue. Dad always intended for me to take over eventually. I wasn't handed anything. I started in quality assurance, then moved to production management, then operations, working my way up through actual merit and performance. By 2020, I was COO. And we'd expanded to $142 million annually with contracts from Apple, Tesla, and Microsoft for precision electronic components. The problem started when Dad got sick. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in January 2024. He was 66 years old and had always been invincible in my eyes. Within 3 months, he deteriorated rapidly. That's when Patrick, my husband of 3 years at that point, started positioning himself. Patrick hadn't built anything in his life. He came from old money. His family owned a chain of luxury car dealerships across the Pacific Northwest. We met at a charity gala in 2019. He was charming, attentive, said all the right things about supporting my career ambitions. Dad liked him initially, though I remember my father pulling me aside before the wedding and saying, "Make sure he signs a prenup, sweetheart. Protect what you've built." I did. That prenup became the first line of defense in what turned into a corporate war. Dad passed away on June 14, 2024. The funeral was on a Thursday. The following Monday, Patrick called an emergency board meeting and proposed himself as interim CEO, citing the need for strong leadership during this transition period. The board, which consisted of my uncle Robert, 2 longtime company advisors named Walter Drummond and Christine Feldman, and Patrick, voted 3-1 in favor. My uncle was the only dissenting vote. I was grieving my father and somehow found myself reporting to my husband in the company my dad had built for me. The first warning sign came 3 weeks later. Patrick brought in an outside consultant named Eric Vanderberg to evaluate operational efficiency. Eric was 38, Harvard MBA, and had a reputation for helping private equity firms acquire and flip manufacturing companies. I recognized the playbook immediately. "Amaya, we need to have a frank discussion about your compensation package," Patrick said during what I thought was a routine check-in meeting. "Your salary of $235,000 plus bonuses is significantly above market rate for a COO at a company this size." Kept my voice level. My compensation was benchmarked against industry standards and approved by the board 3 years ago. My performance reviews have been exemplary, and our operational efficiency is at 94.7%, the highest in company history. Market conditions have changed. Eric's analysis suggests we could hire someone with similar qualifications for $160,000. That's when I understood. Patrick wasn't trying to run the company, he was trying to eliminate me from it, probably to make it more attractive for acquisition. He wanted to cash out Dad's legacy and walk away wealthy. I went home that evening and didn't say a word about the meeting. Instead, I went down to my home office and pulled out every corporate document related to Nova Dynamics that I'd kept in a fireproof safe. My father had taught me to maintain personal copies of important documents, something Patrick never knew about. What I found was interesting. Very interesting. Dad's will left his 60% ownership stake in Nova Dynamics to a trust, with me as the primary beneficiary. However, the trust had specific provisions about when and how the shares would transfer to me. The language was complex, full of legal terminology about vesting schedules, performance triggers, and corporate milestones. At first glance, it looked like I wouldn't receive full control until I turned 46 years away. But there were other documents in that safe. Documents I'd forgotten about. In 2016, when I'd been with the company for 3 years and proved myself capable, Dad had executed a series of agreements. One was a stock option agreement granting me the right to purchase up to 30% additional ownership in the company at a fixed price of $12 per share, exercisable at any time before December 31, 2030. At the time, the company was valued at roughly $40 million, making the shares worth $12 each. Now, with the company valued at approximately $160 million based on recent revenue multiples, those shares were worth roughly $48 each. I could buy 30% of the company for $3,600,000 when it was actually worth $3,600,000. That wasn't even the best part. There was another document, dated 2019, right before I married Patrick. It was an amendment to the original stock option agreement. Dad had added a clause: in the event of a change in corporate control, management restructuring, or attempt to remove Amaya Chin from her operational role within the company, the stock options shall immediately vest and become exercisable, and the purchase price shall be adjusted to fair market value as of the date of the triggering event, payable over 120 months at 2% interest. I read that paragraph 5 times. My father, bless him, had built in a protection mechanism. If anyone tried to force me out, I could immediately exercise my options and pay for them over 10 years at below-market interest rates. Combined with the 60% in the trust that would eventually vest to me, I could potentially control 90% of the company. But there was a problem. The trust didn't give me immediate control. The trustee was my Uncle Robert, and while he supported me, he was bound by the legal language of the trust document. I'd get the shares, but it would take time, possibly years of legal proceedings if Patrick contested it. Unless I could take control before it came to that. I called my father's attorney the next morning. His name was Leonard Ashford, 67 years old, semi-retired but still handling select cases. He'd known my father for 30 years and had drafted every major corporate document for Nova Dynamics. Leonard, I need to understand something about the stock option agreement Dad set up. We met at his office that afternoon, a modest suite in downtown Portland with wood paneling and shelves lined with legal texts. Leonard pulled out his copies of the documents and spread them across the conference table. Your father was very deliberate about protecting you, Leonard said, adjusting his reading glasses. He worried about what might happen if you married someone who didn't have your best interests at heart. He was right to worry. Patrick is trying to force me out. Leonard's expression hardened. Then the triggering clause in the 2019 amendment applies. You can exercise your options immediately. But I don't have $3,600,000 liquid. Most of my assets are tied up in real estate and retirement accounts. You don't need liquid funds. The amended agreement allows for payment over 10 years, and it specifically permits the use of company dividends to pay down the purchase obligation. Essentially, the company pays for your shares out of its own profits. I leaned forward. Walk me through exactly how this works. Leonard pulled out a calculator and started running numbers. Nova Dynamics generated $14,200,000 in net profit last year. Under the corporate bylaws, the company can distribute up to 30% of annual profits as shareholder dividends. That's $4,260,000 annually. If you own 30% of the company, your dividend share would be approximately $1,280,000 per year. Your payment obligation for the purchased shares is $360,000 annually over 10 years. The dividends more than cover the payments. So I exercise the options, take ownership of 30% of the company, and use my dividend distributions to pay for the shares over time. Correct. And once you own 30% combined with allies on the board, you'd have effective control even without the trust shares. I sat back in my chair thinking through the implications. Patrick currently controls the board 3-1 with himself, Walter, and Christine voting as a block. Uncle Robert is the only vote I have. If I own 30% and Uncle Robert controls the 60% trust shares as trustee, together we control 90%. We could reconstitute the board entirely. Exactly. But there's something else. Leonard flipped through his files and pulled out another document. Your prenuptial agreement. Have you reviewed it recently? Not since we signed it 5 years ago. Why? Because it contains a corporate control provision. If either you or Patrick attempts to use your position as spouse to influence corporate decisions regarding Nova Dynamics in a manner contrary to the other spouse's financial interests, that constitutes grounds for immediate separation of assets and termination of any community property claims. I took the document and read the relevant section. The language was dense, but the meaning became clear. Patrick, by trying to reduce my compensation and push me out of the company, had violated the prenup. Under California law, we'd married in San Francisco where Patrick's family had a vacation home. I could file for divorce immediately, and Patrick would have no claim to any assets connected to Nova Dynamics. Leonard, if I exercise my stock options and file for divorce simultaneously, Patrick loses everything. His position as CEO depends on board support, but if I control 30% directly and Uncle Robert controls 60% as trustee, we control 90% of the votes. We can remove him from the board and terminate his employment. That's correct. But you need to move quickly. If Patrick suspects what you're planning, he might try to accelerate his own plans. Has he mentioned anything about selling the company? I thought back over recent conversations. Eric, the consultant, has been asking detailed questions about our client contracts, revenue stability, and EBITDA. Those are exactly the questions someone asks when preparing a company for sale. Leonard nodded grimly. I've seen this before. Patrick brings in Eric to make the company look attractive to buyers, pushes you out to reduce operating costs and make the financials look better, then sells to a private equity firm or strategic buyer. He'd walk away with millions from your father's legacy. How long do I have? The typical timeline for this kind of acquisition is 3 to 6 months from initial valuation to close. If Eric has been working for 3 weeks, you probably have 2 to 4 months before Patrick has a buyer lined up. But you should act within the next 30 days to be safe. I spent the next week gathering information. I needed to understand exactly what Patrick was planning and who was supporting him. My assistant, a sharp 28-year-old named Diana Reeves, was fiercely loyal. She'd worked for me for 4 years and understood the company's operations better than anyone except me. I brought her into my confidence. Diana, I need you to do something that requires absolute discretion. We were in my office after hours, the manufacturing floor quiet below us. Diana had her laptop open, ready to work. Anything you need. I need copies of all communications between Patrick, Eric Vanderberg, Walter Drummond, and Christine Feldman regarding company valuation, potential buyers, or any discussions about restructuring my role. Email, calendar invites, meeting notes, everything. Diana's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't hesitate. I can access Patrick's calendar and email through the executive assistant shared system. Walter and Christine are more difficult, but I can request copies of meeting notes under the guise of preparing board documentation. Be careful. If Patrick suspects anything, he'll lock you out. Leave it to me. 3 days later, Diana handed me a USB drive containing over 400 documents. I spent an entire weekend reading through them, and what I found was worse than I'd expected. Patrick had been in discussions with a private equity firm called Vertex Capital Partners for 2 months, since July, right after my father's funeral. The emails were damning. July 22, 2024, from Patrick to James Kowalski at Vertex Capital. The operational transition is proceeding smoothly. The COO situation will be resolved within 90 days, which should clean up the executive compensation overhead and improve EBITDA margins by approximately 8%. Projecting sale-ready status by November. August 5, 2024, from Eric Vanderberg to Patrick. Completed operational audit. Primary drag on efficiency is legacy compensation structures for senior management. Recommend immediate restructuring. Once the COO position is eliminated, you'll have a much cleaner story for potential buyers. Current valuation. $155 million post-restructuring valuation. $170 million. August 18, 2024, from Christine Feldman to Patrick. Discussed the succession plan with Walter. We're both comfortable with the proposed timeline. Removing Amaya from operations is unfortunate but necessary for maximizing shareholder value. The trust provisions will keep her financially comfortable, and she's still young enough to rebuild her career elsewhere. I felt physically sick reading that last email. Christine had known my father for 15 years. She'd been at my wedding. And she was comfortable helping Patrick steal the company and destroy my career because it was necessary for maximizing shareholder value. But the documents also gave me exactly what I needed. Proof that Patrick was violating his fiduciary duties to shareholders by prioritizing a quick sale over long-term company health. And proof that he was systematically working to remove me, which triggered the protective clauses in my stock option agreement. I called Leonard the next morning. I have everything we need. Patrick has been planning to sell the company since July. He's conspiring with board members to force me out first to make the financials look better. I need to exercise my stock options immediately and file for divorce. I'll prepare the paperwork. You'll need to arrange financing for the initial payment. The agreement requires a 10% down payment upfront, with the balance payable over 10 years. That's $360,000. I can liquidate some investments to cover that. How quickly can we move? I can have the stock option exercise documents ready in 48 hours. The divorce filing will take another day to prepare. We'll execute everything simultaneously to prevent Patrick from having time to react. What about the board? Even if I own 30%, Patrick still has Walter and Christine supporting him. Leonard smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. Amaya, once you file for divorce on grounds of prenuptial agreement violation related to corporate malfeasance, Patrick's position becomes untenable. He's using his role as your husband to undermine your position in the company, which violates both the prenup and his fiduciary duty to shareholders. The board will have to remove him or face potential liability for supporting him. But Walter and Christine have been supporting him actively. Which is why your Uncle Robert, as trustee controlling 60% of shares, will call an emergency shareholder meeting to remove all three of them from the board and install new directors. With 90% of voting shares between you and the trust, it's not even close. I spent the next 48 hours in a state of controlled anxiety, maintaining my normal routine at work while Leonard prepared the documentation. Patrick noticed nothing unusual. He was too busy preparing for a site visit from Vertex Capital Partners, scheduled for the following week. On September 4, 2024, I went to Leonard's office at 8 a.m. Uncle Robert met us there. We reviewed every document carefully: the stock option exercise agreement, the payment schedule, the divorce filing, and the shareholder meeting notice. Amaya, once we file these documents, there's no going back, Leonard said. Patrick will be furious and this will likely get ugly. Are you prepared for that? I thought about my father, about 12 years of building this company, about the 340 employees whose jobs were at risk if Patrick sold to a private equity firm that would strip assets and eliminate positions. I'm ready. Let's do it. I signed the stock option exercise documents. Uncle Robert, as trustee, signed off on the related approvals. Leonard notarized everything and immediately filed the documents with the corporate records office. As of 9:47 a.m. that morning, I owned 30% of Nova Dynamics Corporation. At 10:15 a.m., Leonard filed my petition for divorce in Multnomah County Circuit Court, citing violation of prenuptial agreement provisions related to corporate interference. At 11:30 a.m., Uncle Robert, acting as controlling shareholder through the trust, issued formal notice of an emergency shareholder meeting, scheduled for September 6, 2024, to vote on removal of board members and corporate officers for breach of fiduciary duty. At 2 p.m., a process server delivered copies of all documents to Patrick at the Nova Dynamics headquarters. Diana called me at 2:17 p.m. Patrick just received something from a process server. He went into his office and slammed the door. I could hear him shouting through the walls. Good. Let him shout. Make sure you're documenting everything just in case he does anything rash. At 2:43 p.m. my phone rang. Patrick's name flashed on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. He called 4 more times in the next 10 minutes. I ignored all of them. At 3:15 p.m., I received an email from Patrick's personal attorney, a man named Harrison Fletcher who specialized in high-net-worth divorces. Ms. Chin, your filing today represents a hostile and unwarranted attack on your husband's professional reputation and corporate standing. The allegations regarding corporate interference are baseless. We demand immediate withdrawal of all legal filings and cessation of any attempt to disrupt ongoing business operations. Failure to comply will result in countersuits for tortious interference, defamation, and malicious prosecution. I forwarded the email to Leonard with a single line, "I believe they're upset." Leonard's response came back 5 minutes later. "Let them be upset. They have no case. See you Friday at the shareholder meeting." The next day, September 5th, Patrick tried a different approach. He called an emergency board meeting, excluding Uncle Robert on the grounds that he was no longer an independent director due to his role as trustee for shares that benefited me. Walter, Christine, and Patrick voted to suspend my access to company systems, remove me from all corporate accounts, and place me on immediate administrative leave pending an investigation into corporate misconduct and breach of fiduciary duty. I received the email notification at 11:47 a.m. I was in a meeting with our largest client, Tesla, reviewing a new contract for battery management system components worth $12 million annually. I read the email, smiled politely at the Tesla procurement director, and continued the meeting as if nothing had happened. After the Tesla meeting concluded successfully with a signed contract extension, I called Leonard. "Patrick just tried to suspend me and lock me out of the company." "That was predictable. Doesn't matter. Tomorrow's shareholder meeting supersedes any board action. The shareholders control the board, not the other way around. Can he prevent the meeting from happening? No. Uncle Robert has the legal authority as majority shareholder to call the meeting. Patrick can refuse to attend, but that won't change the outcome. We'll hold the meeting, vote to remove him and his allies from the board, install new directors, and those new directors will immediately reinstate you and terminate Patrick. What if he tries to sell the company before tomorrow? If he's desperate enough. He can't. Any sale requires board approval plus shareholder approval for a transaction of that magnitude. He doesn't have the shareholder votes. Even if Walter and Christine supported a sale, Uncle Robert controls 60% and you control 30%. That's 90% voting against him. The math doesn't work." That evening, Patrick came home to the house we'd shared for 5 years. I'd spent the afternoon packing his belongings. 3 suitcases and 2 boxes sat by the front door. "What the hell is this?" He gestured at the luggage. "You're moving out. The divorce filing includes a motion for exclusive use of the marital residence pending final judgment. Given that the house was purchased with my premarital assets, the judge is likely to grant it." Patrick's face flushed red. "You can't do this. You can't just kick me out of my own home and try to steal my company." "Your company?" I kept my voice calm, almost clinical. "Nova Dynamics was founded by my father. I've worked there for 12 years. You married into it 3 years ago and immediately started plotting to cash out. You don't get to call it your company. I'm the CEO. The board supports me. You exercising some obscure stock options doesn't change anything. Patrick, tomorrow at 10 a.m., there's a shareholder meeting. Uncle Robert and I control 90% of the voting shares. We're removing you from the board along with Walter and Christine. New directors will be appointed who will immediately terminate your employment as CEO. You're done." He stepped closer and for a moment I thought he might become physically aggressive. Instead he just stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before, pure hatred mixed with disbelief. "You think you're smart enough to run this company without me? I ran it for 12 years before you showed up and I'll run it for another 12 after you're gone. The difference is I actually care about the employees and the clients and the legacy my father built. You just wanted to flip it for a profit. Those emails were private corporate communications. How did you even—" He stopped, realization dawning. "You hacked my email. That's corporate espionage. That's illegal." "I didn't hack anything. I requested corporate records through proper channels. All email communications on company servers are company property, not personal property. You should have read the IT policy you signed when you became CEO." Patrick grabbed his phone. "I'm calling my lawyer. We're going to destroy you for this. Call whoever you want. Your lawyer can meet with my lawyer tomorrow after the shareholder meeting, once you're no longer employed by Nova Dynamics." He grabbed the suitcases and boxes, threw them into his Mercedes and drove off with the tires squealing. I watched him leave, then went inside and poured myself a glass of wine. My hands were shaking. The next morning, September 6, 2024, I arrived at the Nova Dynamics headquarters at 9 a.m. The shareholder meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. in the main conference room. Uncle Robert was already there along with Leonard and a court reporter who would document the proceedings. We'd also invited an independent corporate governance expert named Dr. Elizabeth Norton to observe and verify that proper procedures were followed. At 9:45 a.m. Walter and Christine arrived. They looked uncomfortable, whispering to each other in the corner. Patrick arrived at 9:52 a.m. with his attorney Harrison Fletcher. "This meeting is a sham," Harrison announced immediately. "My client intends to challenge the validity of the shareholder vote on grounds that the stock option exercise was improperly executed." Leonard didn't even look up from his documents. "Your challenge is noted for the record and will be disregarded. The stock option agreement was properly executed in accordance with its terms. Ms. Chen's ownership of 30% of the company is legitimate and recorded with the state. Mr. Robert Chen, as trustee for the Raymond Chen Family Trust, controls an additional 60%. Together they represent 90% of voting shares. This meeting is properly called and will proceed." At exactly 10 a.m. Uncle Robert called the meeting to order. "This emergency shareholder meeting is convened to address serious concerns regarding the current board of directors and corporate management. Specifically, evidence has emerged that certain board members and the CEO have been acting contrary to the best interests of shareholders and the company. I move that we vote to remove Patrick Sloan, Walter Drummond, and Christine Feldman from the board of directors effective immediately." "Second," I said. Harrison jumped up. "You can't do this. There are proper procedures for board removal, advance notice requirements." Dr. Norton, the corporate governance expert, spoke for the first time. "Actually, under Oregon corporate law and the specific bylaws of Nova Dynamics Corporation, shareholders controlling more than 2/3 of voting shares can call emergency meetings and vote on director removal without standard notice periods if the matter involves potential breach of fiduciary duty. The documentation provided establishes probable cause for such concerns. The meeting is properly constituted." Uncle Robert called for the vote. "All in favor of removing Patrick Sloan, Walter Drummond, and Christine Feldman from the board of directors?" "Aye," Uncle Robert said, representing 60% of shares. "Aye," I said, representing 30% of shares. The motion passes with 90% of voting shares in favor. Patrick Sloan, Walter Drummond, and Christine Feldman are hereby removed from the board of directors of Nova Dynamics Corporation effective immediately. Christine looked like she might cry. Walter's face was stone. Patrick was on his feet shouting, "This is corporate theft. I'll sue all of you for everything you have." Leonard finally looked up. "Mr. Sloan, you're no longer a board member, which means you're no longer authorized to be in this meeting. Please leave the room." "I'm still so." "Not for long," Uncle Robert said. "I move that we appoint new board members to fill the vacant positions. I nominate myself, Amaya Chin, and Dr. Elizabeth Norton to serve as the board of directors until the next regular shareholder meeting." "Second," I said. We voted. The motion passed 90% to 0%. The remaining 10% of shares were held by a small group of early employees, none of whom were present at the meeting but who had provided proxies to Uncle Robert earlier. With the new board constituted, Uncle Robert immediately called the first board meeting to order. First order of business: the employment status of Patrick Sloan as CEO. I move that Patrick Sloan's employment be terminated for cause, effective immediately, due to breach of fiduciary duty, self-dealing, and conspiracy to sell the company for personal benefit at the expense of shareholders and employees. Second, I said. Dr. Norton, now a board member, reviewed the evidence we'd compiled. The emails and documents provided establish a clear pattern of behavior contrary to shareholder interests. I vote in favor of termination for cause. The vote was unanimous. Patrick Sloan was no longer CEO of Nova Dynamics Corporation. Uncle Robert looked at Patrick, who stood frozen in disbelief. Please surrender your company laptop, phone, access badges, and any other corporate property to building security on your way out. You have 1 hour to collect personal items from your office under supervision. After that, you'll be trespassing. Patrick turned to me, and for a moment the mask dropped completely. This was a man who'd planned to cash out on my father's legacy, who'd systematically worked to eliminate me from the company I'd helped build, who'd married me at least partly because it gave him access to corporate power. "You'll regret this," he said quietly. "No," I replied. "I really won't." Security escorted Patrick out of the building at 11:47 a.m. I watched from my office window as he loaded boxes into his Mercedes and drove away. The new board's second order of business was appointing a new CEO. Uncle Robert nominated me. Dr. Norton seconded. The vote was unanimous. As of September 6, 2024, I was the CEO of Nova Dynamics Corporation. The third order of business was addressing Walter and Christine. While they'd been removed from the board, they still held advisory positions within the company. We terminated those contracts that afternoon. The fourth order of business was dealing with Eric Vanderberg. His consulting contract was cancelled, effective immediately. He'd been paid $85,000 for 6 weeks of work that amounted to corporate espionage. We considered suing for breach of contract but ultimately decided it wasn't worth the time or legal fees. By 5 p.m. that day I'd cleaned house completely. Patrick, Walter, Christine and Eric were gone, not just removed from their roles, but escorted off the premises, their access revoked, their influence severed like a corrupted wire from a precision circuit. There was no ambiguity, no room for manipulation or last-minute appeals. The boardroom was reset, the executive floor recalibrated, and the soul of Nova Dynamics, my father's soul, was finally breathing again. I promoted Diana Reeves to Vice President of Operations before the sun set. She'd earned it not just through loyalty, but through skill, discretion, and an encyclopedic understanding of our supply chain and production timelines. She'd stood with me when others saw only political expediency. My Uncle Robert, steady and principled, assumed the role of chairman of the board, a symbolic and strategic move that signaled continuity, stability, and familial stewardship over corporate opportunism. That evening, over takeout in the quiet of my office, we drafted our first 90-day plan. No layoffs, no asset stripping, no cosmetic financial engineering. Only rebuilding. The next morning I called an all-hands meeting. All 340 employees, engineers, assemblers, quality inspectors, logistics coordinators, even the night shift janitorial team, gathered in the main manufacturing bay. The air was thick with anxiety. Whispers had swirled since Patrick's furious exit the day before. Is the company being sold? Are we getting laid off? Is Amaya in charge now? Or is this just another power play? I climbed onto the raised platform near the assembly line, where my father used to address the team during quarterly celebrations. I looked out at faces I'd known for years. Some I'd hired myself, others who'd trained me when I was a nervous 22-year-old in quality assurance. I know the past few days have been chaotic, I began, my voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. I want to be completely transparent about what happened, and what happens next. My father built this company not to flip it, not to extract value, but to last. To provide good jobs with dignity. To serve our clients with excellence, not just meet quotas. Over the past few months, some people lost sight of that vision. They saw Nova Dynamics as a line item on a balance sheet, something to be bought and sold for personal profit. That ends now. I didn't sugarcoat it. I told them everything. How Patrick, within weeks of my father's funeral, began positioning himself for control. How he brought in a consultant to streamline operations by cutting me, and eventually them, out. How he conspired with board members to dilute my role and boost short-term EBITDA for a private equity sale. I explained the stock option clause my father had embedded in 2019, a legal tripwire designed to protect his legacy, and how Patrick's attempt to push me out had triggered it. I described the emergency shareholder vote, the 90% majority, and the immediate removal of those who'd betrayed the company's mission. I am not here to maximize shareholder value in the narrowest sense, I said, making deliberate eye contact with workers on the far side of the floor. I'm here to maximize human value, yours. That means job security. It means investment in your skills. It means wages that reflect your contribution and benefits that honor your loyalty. Nova Dynamics isn't a commodity. It's a community. The silence held for a heartbeat, then applause began. Not polite clapping but a rising wave of relief, pride and restored trust. A woman in the front row wiped her eyes. An older machinist gave me a slow, solemn nod. They weren't just employees. They were stakeholders in a legacy they'd helped build. Over the next 6 months, I rebuilt Nova Dynamics not with grand pronouncements, but with deliberate daily choices rooted in that promise. First, I renegotiated our major client contracts, not to squeeze every dollar but to deepen relationships. The Tesla extension I'd signed moments before Patrick tried to lock me out became the template. Longer terms, mutual R&D investment, shared sustainability goals. Apple agreed to expand its precision sensor order after we co-developed a new thermal resistance alloy. Microsoft committed to a 3-year partnership for aerospace-grade housings, citing our unmatched reliability. These weren't transactions, they were alliances. Second, I invested in our people as the core strategic asset. Patrick had seen veteran technicians as cost centers. I saw them as institutional memory, craftsmanship, and mentors. We launched Nova Academy, a tuition-free upskilling program in CNC programming, lean manufacturing, and AI-assisted quality control. Wages rose by an average of 12%, retroactive to the day I took over. Health premiums dropped. Parental leave expanded. The result? Turnover plummeted from 23% to just 7%, and applicants flooded in from across the Pacific Northwest. Third, we embraced innovation without erasing our workforce. We bought 3 next-generation CNC machines and an AI-powered visual inspection system, but instead of hiring temps or outsourcing, we retrained 42 existing employees. Diana oversaw the transition with military precision, ensuring no one was left behind. Productivity soared, but so did morale. People weren't afraid of the machines, they mastered them. By March 2025, the numbers told a story of resilience and renewal. Revenue: $156 million, up 10%. Net profit margin: 12.3%, up from 9.8%. Client retention: 97%. On-time delivery: 97.8%. Defect rate: 0.4%, making us one of the cleanest suppliers in the electronics ecosystem. Employee satisfaction: 8.7 out of 10. We also broke into medical device manufacturing, leveraging our ISO 13485 certified clean rooms, and filed patents for 3 new technologies, including a self-calibrating circuit module that caught the attention of NASA. Meanwhile, Patrick's legal crusade collapsed under its own weight. His divorce claim failed because the prenup explicitly shielded premarital assets and penalized corporate interference, exactly what he'd done. His wrongful termination suit was dismissed with prejudice. The board minutes and emails were damning. Even his corporate espionage allegation backfired when the court ruled company emails were corporate property. He burned through $340,000 in legal fees and ended up managing a single Porsche dealership in Seattle, his reputation in ruins. Walter and Christine faded into obscurity. Eric's consulting firm lost credibility. But at Nova we moved forward. In January 2025, the trust shares vested on my 35th birthday, another quiet milestone my father had embedded in the legal architecture. With my 30% stake, I now own 90% of Nova Dynamics. The remaining 10%? Held by the employees who'd stayed through lean years. I refused to buy them out. Their ownership was earned, not granted. When a private equity firm offered $220 million, more money than I'd ever imagined, I declined instantly. This company isn't for sale, I told them. It's a promise. Now I'm sharing that story beyond our walls. Mentoring women in family businesses, speaking at founder conferences, advocating for legal safeguards that protect legacy over liquidity. Because what happened to me could happen to anyone. But with foresight, documentation, and unwavering commitment to values over valuation, you can take back what's yours and build something that lasts.